I mean, you're definitely right that there are people who get to, bigotry is the right word, but they get to this sort of uh, monomaniacal view of things through being certain about a particular view. So what's the source of that? Is that sort of epistemic bubbles where all the information just comes from one side, or what?
Yeah, well, I think that the epistemic bubbles are, I think that's an accelerant. I don't know that it's a cause. I think, yeah, so I think there are lots of things that we tend to look at that are, they tend to get pointed to as causes, and they're actually more of accelerants. So social media, the epistemic bubble, the, media silos, cable news programming, all that stuff. I think all play a role. I don't think of them as causally, um, as causally sort of doing the work, because they, so if you look at sort of the epistemic bubbles or the silos or in, all of those things, they don't, in my view, they can explain why we, or they can help explain why we are so hostile towards one another. They can help explain why we, you know yeah, why we don't trust each other. They can't really explain why that distrust manifested in the particular way that it did. And so to me, they don't provide the causal explanation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. So tell me more about where you think the true causal explanation lies.
So the causal explanation, as I can, this is again, this is sort of going into the second book, which is not out yet. Um,
So the second book you just said before we started recording has a possible title of
well, the
Presumptions
title
of
as of
Guilt.
this morning, yeah,
Okay.
presumption of guilt.
This,
This is the title as of this morning,
this is
but I
breaking
I don't
news
know.
on Free Kiwis
I
here.
know, breaking news. I know everyone's on the edge
Exclusive.
of their
Yeah.
seat.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. This is going to make your career here, right now, right here. Yeah. So, but what the book is about, the manuscript is largely done. What the book is about is it traces out how this moral recoding happened. This idea, this moral condemnation of disagreement. This idea that if you don't do X, Y, and Z, and mostly it's the moral condemnation that comes from the left, so that the non-progressive, the conservative views are racist, bigoted, ignorant, etc. And that actually you can trace to a very specific shift, which sort of was centered in the US, I think, as I understand it, but had international implications just because of the way, frankly, because of the way ideas spread. Um, and so this is going back. I don't, is your audience going to be interested? How far back do you want me to go?
No, no,
Do you want me to
definitely. We're
go?
interested in. I mean, I go as far back as the fifth century BC sometimes. So you said,
Oh, okay. So no, so I'm not going that far back. But what I would say is, if you look back to the civil rights movement in this, and I'm talking particularly about the US context at this, but
yeah,
the argument expands more broadly. But in the US context, if you look at the civil rights movement, one of the things that happened around the civil rights movement was that inequality. So after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made discrimination, with its 11 titles, made discrimination illegal across in the private sector, across everywhere, right? Where that wasn't the case beforehand. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, anti-discrimination cases could really just be brought under the 14th Amendment, under the Equal Protection Clause. And
so you
so the
had to
Civil
have.
Rights Act,
So does that mean
what?
you had to
And
cross state lines or something like that? I think I.
you had to, well, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. Was
Oh,
what was, you're talking about the Transportation Clause, which is what the Civil Rights Act was brought under, I
oh,
think.
maybe it's that. I think I heard a podcast about this
Right.
ages ago. Yeah.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
is really, I actually just heard someone talking about that, which I thought
Oh,
was
okay.
fascinating. But
Yeah.
that is, the Civil Rights Act was brought under the not transformation,
Yeah.
Transportation
Yeah.
Clause.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964. For the 14th Amendment, you had to, it had to be, it had to be a state sponsored, right? Because it's under the Constitution, it didn't cover private institutions or private organizations, but you
Okay.
also had to demonstrate intent. So this problem of demonstrating intent to discriminate is really hard, right? Like it's, short of a smoking gun, sort of a letter or something saying, I don't want to hire women, or I don't want to hire minorities or something. It's very hard to prove intent. Usually what ends up happening is intent can be proven by the absence of any plausible explanation, any other plausible explanation, right? But there's almost always some other plausible explanation, except in rare cases. Yick versus Woe was one of the Supreme Court cases that was a rare exception to this. Um, okay, so around the civil rights movement, so anti-discrimination law, so in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, um, part of what happened was in an effort to, I assume, I'm making an assumption about intent here, but in an effort to give sort of more teeth and more power to anti-discrimination law, at the time, there was a court case that determined that disparate outcomes, this was in the early 1970s, in 1971, that disparate outcomes were evidence of just could be evidence of a violation that would constitute a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which was the title under the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that banned discrimination in employment in the labor market. And so these ideas that disparate outcomes, that unequal outcomes were themselves evidence of racism, these ideas had been around in kind of activist and academic circles for a while. Like this was not,
It sounds
go
like in
ahead.
that context, there really were kind of semi-obvious cases of racism going on. And they brought in this law
I think that's
basically
right.
because it was so hard to prove. But now we've shifted to a position where you just
Well,
almost assume from the get-go
I think that's
that
right. I think, and actually, if you look at the 1971 case, which is Griggs versus Duke Power, like it's very clear. Like it was a unanimously decided case on the Supreme Court. Like it's not a mystery to me how they got there. What I would say is, and again, like I want to be clear, this set of ideas about inequality and racism and sort of racism, the idea of racism without racist intent, those were around in academia and in activist circles for a long time before the Supreme Court case. What the Supreme Court case did was it institutionalized the idea. It said that so under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, discrimination with intent, like I don't want to hire women, was always illegal, right? That was always right. What it did is it said actually discrimination without intent can also be a violation of Title VII. So it legally equated these two
Mhm.
things. And what I think happened is that the moral equation followed almost automatically,
Mhm.
right? Because once the court, so again, the court didn't give birth to these ideas, but the court legally equated them. And once that happened, the moral equation, right? Particularly for the left, for whom this would be sort of naturally something they were more sympathetic to in terms from on the political stage, and so that moral equation, which again, like I think was again just what we just said, the legal case was very. It's not a. It was again. It was unanimously decided. Like it's very understandable what the thinking was that led to that case. The moral equation, the moral recoding that followed, once you equate disparities with discrimination, once you treat that not as a hypothesis, but as a statement that these two things are this is this, right? Disparities equal discrimination. That becomes a claim that is treated as given. This is like this is it's certain, the certainty trap, right? It becomes treated as given, so now it's something that you can't question, right?
Mhm.
That changes much more than just how we think about inequality. It changes how we think about everything from the role of intent to the how what power means, the idea of harm,
But
structural advantage, structural disadvantage.
does
It
it also
recodes
mean there's all
everything.
like in certain
Yeah.
situations there are almost no good reasons sort of not to hire someone because they're black, right? I mean, because you might, I mean, there's no good reasons to hire someone when they're black. I mean, sorry. So I actually believe there's no good reasons not to hire someone because they're black. But I mean, like,
Yeah.
there may be situations where you actually are thinking this guy's CV isn't very good, but he happens to be black or happens to be a woman or something. And now, that looks dodgy now, whereas in the past, there were probably some legitimate reasons that they would have accepted right before
Well,
this
I think
legal
I
change.
think what it says if you're equating inequality with racism, what it means is that underrepresentation in any field, in whether it's in STEM, whether it's in middle management, upper management, whatever it is, underrepresentation is itself the result of discrimination or racism operating at some level. And so what it means is that this is where you bring in sort of ideas about unconscious bias and right, because if the racism is not living in the hearts and minds of people, it's living sort of in systems, it's living, it can be there without people's
Mm,
intention for it to be there, then that suggests we need to re-examine all of our processes for hiring, for, right? And so if you are leaning towards not hiring the person who is a member of a group that is structurally under this new thinking, like that is structurally disadvantaged, right? Because based on out and frankly, like if you're using outcomes as a measure, who is a member of a group that is structurally disadvantaged, right? But then the evidence becomes the inequality. The evidence becomes the
yeah,
inequality itself, right? And so the mechanism is less clear, but the evidence is the inequality because the inequality is dispositive proof that there's something immoral going on with respect to racism and discrimination.
right.
Um, and again, I want to be clear that what I'm pointing out, it's not a claim that discrimination isn't real or that racism isn't real. What I'm saying is that what creates the certainty trap and the recoding is the assumption that inequality is itself evidence of this moral
Yeah,
failing.
that's right. Yeah.
That is the problem.